Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded version of Behind the Headlines. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and friend, Simon Barrett. And this evening, we're going to be talking about the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and how he has turned his back on democratic freedoms in enacting, I would say, reprehensible legislation that will even be freezing the finances of anyone who has shown support for the Freedom Convoy of truckers. We're recording this on Tuesday, the 22nd of February. You're watching it on Wednesday, the 23rd of February. We will also be joined by a guest, Dr. Joe Boot, who is on the front line of the activity in Canada. So welcome to the show. Simon, it's been in the news a little bit, but not much. We've heard a perspective of the Canadian truckers and how it's being framed almost as like an insurrection against Justin Trudeau. We have perhaps seen clips, especially through social media, of this very large convoy of truckers that was on its way to Ottawa. It then camped out in Ottawa before being dispersed in the past week. The dispersal of these peaceful protesters, I mean, it was a party-like atmosphere. There were people who were singing, dancing, people who were praying, people who were flipping burgers and hot dogs and whatnot, and they had bouncy castles and everything. It was a bit of a family-friendly party atmosphere for freedom, and yet this was framed in this way where Justin Trudeau actually compared these peaceful protesters with Nazis. He compared them with terrorists and sent in the mounted police to break it up. We saw horrific video footage. I sent you a few links of these Mounties trampling on protesters, including a disabled elderly woman. So, I mean, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it's very, very disturbing. Primarily because the Canadian truckers were labelled as heroes of 2020 and 2021 during the height of the pandemic. They are the ones that provided the much needed food supplies, and during that time when Justin Trudeau closed the border between Canada and the United States, so only really the truckers and emergency services could go through the borders. They were classified as heroes, and now they've been compared to Nazis, to white supremacists, and the vileness and the hatred being directed towards them on behalf of Justin Trudeau's government is absolutely shocking and disgraceful. And so therefore, I think what we're seeing in Canada represents a great danger of what we could see happen right across the West. And that is that if you don't toe the line or support the entire agenda of extreme left-wing liberal government, then you can have your bank accounts frozen. I mean, that is what is very disturbing. I mean, he even threatened to kill their pets as well. I mean, this is just absolutely barbaric. And then to give himself executive emergency powers, only his father Pierre Trudeau used in the 70s to stop Quebecian separatists from carrying out terrorist attacks, but to use emergency powers in order to defeat and break up the Freedom Convoy is absolutely alarming, because what's at stake here is our very democratic freedoms. Our ability then to carry out a kind of peaceful protest, which is based on a kind of righteous motives. Otherwise, the world is heading for tyranny, and Justin Trudeau has just led Canada, which was a liberal, freedom-loving, democratic nation, into tyranny.
We began to see some very real signs of something being even more amiss than was apparent when a few weeks ago there was a massive donation campaign for these truckers. A reminder, isolated pretty much on their own in their trucks. Most of the time they are essential for the healthy running of society, but they bitter
conditions,
conditions, and yet they value the freedom of the Canadian people, and so that after 2 years of extreme restrictions on personal freedoms and no sign of let-up in Canada, while the rest of the world is opening up, Canada seems to be isolating and closing down and losing its relevance even more. They decided to peacefully resist and make an open show of their disagreement with the Canadian government's ongoing policies. And in the process of receiving donations from GoFundMe, it was then announced, doubtless by pressure from Justin Trudeau and others, that GoFundMe would not be allocating the funds donated to these Canadian truckers to them, and that they said that they wouldn't be going to the Canadian truckers. GoFundMe unilaterally said they would be donated to other charities,
including the Canadian government, I've heard as well.
Yeah, and so I mean, if you were to donate to a charity, Simon, and you found out that the donation was taken and seized upon by the government, and they said, okay, we're actually going to give this to our selected charities, or we're going to take this, we would both agree that's unjust, it's unethical, it's immoral even, and yet that's what has happened. So after a lot of pressure, GoFundMe, realizing that it actually was going to be losing money on this, said, no, we're going to send out automatic refunds to everyone who's donated. Another platform that is okay with free speech and peaceful protest, it seems like a normal thing that we should accept in our democratic nations, but Give, Send, Go said, yeah, we will make sure that the funds get to the truckers. And we're talking millions of Canadian dollars, millions being donated. And what happens? Well, Give, Send, Go can only do what it is allowed to do and enabled to do to a degree by the Canadian government, right? So when they have the funds frozen, when they're in some way barred, they can't get out the donations. And this is exactly what happened. Emergency powers were enacted that froze anyone's bank account who's involved.
But I mean, these are people giving. So, for example, an ordinary Canadian who supports the Freedom Convoy say, look, I'm going to give $50 to support these truckers. I found out that their own bank accounts have been frozen. And they can't get access to their money. So to actually have a government that actually takes and freezes people's own personal money in which they've earned is absolutely shocking, and we need to wake up to this, and our Western media also, particularly our kind of mainstream TV networks, need to understand that what's happening in Canada needs reporting, because it's very similar to what's happening in China. So you can see also the introduction of a Chinese social credit system happening in China, that sorry, you are not abiding by the rules of Trudeau's government, you are not supporting us in our extreme left woke liberal ideology, so therefore we're going to freeze your bank accounts. This is something that we expect in China, not in Canada.
The people of Canada faced extreme measures over the past 2 years in the government's response to the COVID-19 virus. Churches were closed. Initially, this was a blanket closure. Then churches were allowed to open with 30% capacity. Many churches have persisted in staying open, too few, but some have persisted in staying open at maximum capacity, and they are thriving, they are healthy, but their pastors have faced imprisonment. James Coates, I believe it's Tim Stevens is another, as well as Artur Pawlowski. These have been names that have been particularly headlined as pastors, as leaders who have stood up to the Canadian government overreach and have found themselves imprisoned and facing severe fines. People might say, well, did they learn that lesson? Their churches are thriving. They're not financially incapacitated. One church was even moved off of its own property. It had its own property, and the government came in and forced the closure of the building forcing them to meet outside or find another location. I mean, we're talking about, like you just said, the sort of thing that you come to expect in China happening in one of our Western supposed democracies. Now, in response to Justin Trudeau's extreme authoritarian measures against the Freedom Convoy, we have seen an influential Canadian clergyman, various pastors across the country respond to this. The truckers have, of course, responded, and they have been very active at the forefront of upholding freedom. The Canadian public as well. And yet, just this week, Simon, Trudeau and co have enforced yet another batch of emergency measures. I believe they're supposed to last for at least another month, potentially even 2 to 3 months more.
Let's have a look now at some of these CBN news reports that look into the plight of the Freedom Convoy and Justin Trudeau's increasingly authoritarian measures to actually defeat the protesters.
Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government are turning more tyrannical, folks. The cold way up there in the Great White North must be freezing their minds. The nonviolent Freedom Convoy, the truckers, and other protesters fed up with Ottawa's excessive COVID mandates have now become Canada's public enemy #1. Court orders and an unconstitutional decree by Trudeau, the taking of powers that only really belong to the Canadian Parliament, have dampened the protests for now. But this crackdown may backfire and actually create more public support for the truckers. They are laborers, by the way, that we depend upon to deliver goods to market and keep our supply chains moving. Yeah, those guys. They were once cheered as heroes at the height of the pandemic. Now suddenly the Canadian government considers them to be criminals. How quickly the tide turns when people actually stand up to autocratic orders. One of the most egregious actions came this week when a Canadian court froze $9.5 million in Freedom Convoy assets raised through Give, Send, Go. That's a Christian-owned crowdfunding platform used by the truckers. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me a Canadian court has no legal right to block the assets of an American company operating in the USA. Give, Send, Go seems like David going up against Goliath here. Company co-founder Heather Wilson told Faithwire her organization will fight the Canadian government in court.
Freedom, both spiritually and physically, came at such a high price that we're not going to trample on it and say it doesn't matter. It does matter. And this is probably going to be the fight of my life. And I feel so humbled that God would use me and my brother and my family and our employees to take on this battle because we feel so adequate. But then you read the Bible, and every single story you read where something miraculous happened, guess what? That person felt inadequate, said, I can't do this. And God said, yeah, I don't want you to do it. I'm going to do it.
You can watch that full interview on our Faithwire page on Facebook. And bravo, Heather Wilson. I agree with you. Keep advocating for liberty. Our rights and freedoms do come from God, not government. Yes, He gave them to us in the Garden of Eden, long before the Justin Trudeau government. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels, social media, and our broadcast affiliates. And until next time, be blessed.
After weeks of protests, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is taking drastic action to put an end to the Freedom Convoy protests.
The time to go home is now.
Trudeau invoking emergency powers, allowing the government to remove cars and trucks, suspend their insurance, and even freeze truckers' personal and corporate bank accounts. He says the powers will be limited in scope and that he's not calling in the military.
The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country.
Meanwhile, traffic is moving again across the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest land border crossing between the U.S. and Canada.
The blockade at our border in Windsor has now come to an end. The Ambassador Bridge has reopened.
Officials, though, are turning back non-Canadians trying to join the blockade that's brought weeks of protest over vaccine mandates and COVID restrictions to Ottawa and disrupted daily life. On Sunday, 24 people were arrested. Officials are also blocking donations for truckers. A Canadian judge freezing more than $8 million in donations to a crowdfunding site.
This is probably going to be the fight of my life.
Heather Wilson, co-founder of the U.S.-based crowdfunding site GiveSendGo, is fighting back.
We're going to continue this fight for freedom. This is absolutely insane that governments think they can step in and trample on people's God-given rights.
And the company has broad support. So far, nearly $9 million have been raised through GiveSendGo for these truckers. Jenna Browder, CBN News.
And we're so grateful for CBN and their news reports, because there are very few networks that are willing to tell the truth regarding this situation and tend to ignore it. And the fact is that, according to my notes here, let's put this in context. So in January 2022, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told the truckers that they had to receive vaccines in order to obtain a vaccine mandate passport to cross over the Canadian border into the United States. As they did previously during the pandemic, there were no isolation checks. They didn't need a vaccine mandate passport to get through the border and come back again. But the new rules introduced by Justin Trudeau meant that any truckers who were unvaccinated had to be required to do a 10-day self-isolation. And this is what a lot of the truckers got really concerned about. Justin Trudeau threatened that these truckers would lose their license and would be given a criminal record. And of course, then we saw this led to a grassroots movement to oppose the authoritarian measures pursued by Trudeau's government and the truckers from all over Canada in the convoy that's become known as Freedom Convey. They took their protest to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa in freezing, snowy conditions. And many of these truckers, Reagan, I mean, they travelled from British Columbia and other parts of Canada, and Canada's a huge country. About 500 truckers in all took part in these protests, because they were saying that, you know, if we don't stand up to these authoritarian measures put in place by Trudeau's government, who will? So again, we see that the democracy is a very, very fragile thing. It's a gift that's been given to us. And how would the Canadians who fought in the First and also in the Second World War, fighting to defend Europe's freedom, be feeling now, knowing that their democratic freedoms have been taken away by a power-hungry madman in Justin Trudeau?
We're not talking about just standard restrictions. Like, okay, we've seen some sign of overreach in the US and the UK, and probably across the world in some ways, in reaction to COVID-19. But Trudeau has gone overboard, beyond anything anyone else has even considered in reaction to these peaceful protests. He's threatened that these drivers, men and women alike, could lose their license. They will have criminal records, which we know almost in any Western society, it's borderline impossible to get a job outside of entrepreneurship if you have a criminal record. It's a very difficult thing. Extortionate fines, the frozen bank accounts, which we've mentioned, and even bizarrely, the threat to seize and kill their pets. Those who've supported the truckers financially have also been hit with warnings of sanctions. Even the head of police in Ottawa said that anyone found to be involved in giving support for this protest or to have been involved in this protest will be hunted down, they will be tracked down, and they will face imprisonment or heavy sanctions. So there's no incentive even to give up the protest. If you're in it, you're in it. You're already involved, and there are these threats that the police have been making under license of Trudeau. So in order to break the Freedom Convoy, this Emergencies Act has been invoked. We saw mounted police going in, trampling protesters. There's video footage of police smashing car and truck windows, dragging people out of their vehicles. I mean, we're talking extreme levels of aggression on the part of these police. Beatings. I saw one CCTV footage of a few police with a person on the floor, not resisting arrest or anything, repeatedly kneeing the individual in the back and using a baton as well. So we're talking brutal behavior.
And use of horses as well.
Yeah, yeah.
What concerns me the most as well, it isn't kind of peaceful protest part of our democratic system that, we're allowed to have peaceful protests as long as they don't resort into violence and destruction. And I can't see in any of these protests that there's been any property damage or violent destructions. No. I can't see any riots that have taken place. So how can the Canadian government and the American government in particular this one, because we also have to understand that for this vaccine mandate to actually work, it needs the cooperation of the United States. And many of these truckers were saying that because they'd had the mandate, they've got the app, that the American port authorities knew before they even crossed over into the American border that they had been fully vaccinated. So in other words, America seems to be very much cooperating, or certainly Biden and Democrats, with Justin Trudeau. But how, for example, if you compare this to the BLM, Black Lives Matter riots of May 2020, and of course what happened there was horrific, but there's no justification for almost burning down entire cities in a 5-mile radius, and yet that's fine. No prosecutions have been brought regarding that. We welcome law and order, and this big movement in the States to defund the police, and yet here we see these non-violent demonstrations that were clearly a threat to Justin Trudeau's premiership, resulting to giving him emergency powers in order to crack down and break up the Freedom Convoy. But also what concerns me is his talks in Parliament by just referring to these patriotic, loving Canadians who love freedom, who love their country, and referring them to as swastika waving Nazis, white supremacists, and being racist in order to shut down any debate and any discussion on this whatsoever. He could have easily, if he was a pragmatic Prime Minister, met with the leaders of the truckers and came to some sort of agreement. But he's been absolutely adamant, I'm doing it my way, that's it, I've won. And now he's calling for healing after this, after he's won. But we just pray and hope that he pays an absolutely catastrophic electoral cost for his Napoleon-like actions.
Putting it bluntly, Justin Trudeau is an angry and abusive leader. He is not seeking reconciliation or restoration. He's not even listening when people in the Canadian governmental system have stood up to challenge or to speak on behalf of their constituents. He has stormed out on 2 occasions. He's stormed out of government proceedings because he will not have anyone saying that he's overreaching. But one of the things that that is contrasting with this situation is his reaction not only to these protesters, but his reaction previously to attacks on Christians. Okay, so there are many Christians involved in the freedom movement, in the protests that have occurred. Praying, hymn singing can be heard. But according to the Daily Telegraph, when reports which turned out to be false of mass graves of Indigenous school children surfaced, left-wing activists burned 30 churches in response. Trudeau called the actions, quote, understandable, end quote, and did little to stop this attack on Catholic communities. I remember seeing the stories and the outrage of people, even professing Christians, without looking at evidence, hearing evidence, without just taking at face value what's seen. Mass graves of Indigenous children. This is a great evil. This is perpetrated by Christians and stuff. A lot of stuff put out there without any investigation. Immediately latched on condemning, canceling all of this. leading to extreme liberals then burning these churches down. Trudeau says their actions are understandable. Elite institutions and mainstream media, many of whom uncritically promoted the moral panic around mass graves and abetted the myth of Canada as genocidal, are increasingly embracing this woke ideology for their embrace of an ethos of ultra-sensitivity to the optics of how policies, symbols, or statements affect minority groups has become so extreme that even left-wing journalists have had enough. So left-wing journalists are now saying, yeah, this has gone too far. Not everything is the fault of Christianity. Not everything is the fault of churches. Not everything is the fault of a more right-leaning politic. The truckers have tapped into the alienation of culturally conservative working-class Canadians from Trudeau and the culturally elite. And, as if on cue, the Canadian media has tried to portray the protest as racist, following on the extremists on its fringes. These extremists have cropped up here and there and have repeatedly been removed and asked to leave by the protesters who are there. Now, we have the privilege of welcoming into the program, this is an interview that I conducted earlier in the week with Dr. Joe Boot, who is the founder and president of the Ezra Institute, an institution that is primarily for the Christian engagement of culture there in Canada. And I know this will be helpful to each of our viewers. Dr. Joe Boot is the founder and president of the Ezra Institute. Welcome to the program, Joe.
Great to be on the show, Reagan. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Now, you are actually right now in Canada. Tell us a little bit about what's going on, where you are, what the lay of the land is at the moment. We read a lot of news coming from Canada. We're hearing a lot of rumblings of a totalitarian state, Trudeau taking emergency powers into his hands, even freezing people's bank accounts. Is all of this really true? What's going on?
Yeah, well, I'm actually afraid most of it is. The situation in Canada, I mean, many in the UK will have been observing Australia, New Zealand, Canada for the last couple of years. But in a nutshell, Canada has had one of the sort of most draconian, long-lasting and hard-line set of lockdown measures and restrictions of any nation in the world. We are still in across the nation, and here I'm in Ontario in Canada, which is the largest province, and of course it's where both Toronto and Ottawa are in Ontario. It's the most populous province in Ontario. In the country, I should say, and we are still in under mask mandates, vaccine passports, restrictions on gatherings inside and out, restrictions on worship services, and so on. So, and there are varieties of that right across the nation, and so this is kind of over a period of time has reached a kind of boiling point for some people, or at least a point at which they can no longer feel that they can tolerate the destruction of their livelihoods, their businesses, their children's education. So we have a situation where many people have lost their jobs. Federal mandates and provincial mandates have forced many people out of work. We have young people who are not able to attend university because of vaccine mandates. We have people right across the province and the nation who, because of those mandates, aren't able to participate in everyday life. And this has gone on now for the better part of 2 years. Now, for myself, as a pastor, almost 2 years ago now, after an initial couple of weeks of seeing whether there really was a hurricane outside, and then realizing it was a moderate breeze, got involved with another pastor in a campaign to reopen Ontario churches. And after a good deal of pressure over and hundreds of signatures over a period of time, we ended up in a meeting with the provincial government, and we got the churches open in Ontario at 30%. But it wasn't long before we were back into another lockdown. And unfortunately, there's not been a united front in the church. And in the end, there not being enough pastors and Christian leaders ready to stand up, you've seen that God has been using some ordinary truckers. And a huge convoy a few weeks ago started crossing the nation, camped out eventually in Ottawa, in the nation's capital, and began a peaceful protest against all of these measures, initially because the absurd mandate was introduced by the federal government on top of numerous other federal regulations. By the way, that includes right now that if you are unvaccinated, you cannot enter or leave this country, you cannot get on a plane, you cannot get on a train. The federal government introduced a mandate for truckers crossing the border in and out of Canada. Our biggest trading partner here is the United States. A mandate was introduced that these truckers who sit in their cabs, they don't interact with other people, would need to be vaccinated. And that triggered this convoy, but the convoy became, in the end, more than an active sort of campaign against mandates for truckers, and it became a freedom convoy, if you will, right, where it really captured the imagination of the nation and of people. The people were lighting the streets and the bridges as the convoy was making its way to Ottawa. And for the last 3 weeks, there was a peaceful protest in Ottawa. A weekend ago, a week or so ago, I was there myself to see for myself, because the national coverage was that this was a bunch of racist, misogynist, hateful people who were trying to overthrow the government. And you got there and it was children and families eating candy floss and jumping on bouncy castles. The streets were clean, no broken glass, not a single shop was boarded up, no violence. People singing the national anthem, draped in the Canadian flag, praying, large numbers of Christians there. And that's how this sort of all reached its kind of apogee in the last few days, where many of you will have seen that an unprecedented, actually, event took place. The revised War Measures Act is called the Emergency Powers Act. It was 1988, never been used before. And Trudeau invoked it, the Liberal government invoked it to supposedly break up this, what they started to call an insurrection. So it took on they were borrowing something out of the Biden playbook, I think, from Washington. And now the bouncy castles and the flags and the singing and praying was seen as an insurrection, as an attempt to topple the government itself. And that was the justification used for the Emergency Powers Act. And over the last few days, people who have given, donated to Give, Send, Go or GoFundMe have been having their bank accounts frozen, their credit cards frozen, access to their money cut off. They've been arrested, detained in the city. So the organizers have been arrested. Some of them have been bailed, others haven't. And the police, the RCMP, and heavily armed riot police with armored vehicles and horses were sent in to break up crowds of people singing, praying, dancing, flipping burgers, sitting in hot tubs, and pleading with police that this was a legal, peaceful protest. And you may have seen images of an old woman, an elderly lady, actually an Indigenous woman, with a walker being ridden down by riot officers on horses. And in some instances, the windows of the truckers were smashed and they were dragged out at gunpoint. So it's been very, very heavy-handed. It's like taking out a sledgehammer to kill an ant crawling on the kitchen floor. The attempt by the media has been to spin this into an insurrection, when it was a peaceful protest of people who represent clearly millions of people who are tired of and fed up with the massive state overreach in Canada. So that pretty much is a sort of 5-minute summary of the situation here.
I appreciate that. It sounds like a very, very trying time, particularly for Christians. You mentioned just a moment ago that there were restrictions on churches and on gatherings of believers together. And you also mentioned that you were a part of a campaign early on to allow churches to regather. It was successful initially, 30% capacity. In light of what's continued, you have written a letter that other ministers, as I understand, have signed, they've co-signed with you, challenging Trudeau's behavior. Tell us a little bit about that letter, how supportive Christians have been. Tell us a little bit about the churches that have stood alongside you and what might come as a result of that letter.
Mm-hmm. So over the last couple of years, we've seen, I would describe it as a small, perhaps even could be described as a very small segment of the Christian population in Canada and Christian leaders in Canada resisting state overreach, upholding the historic constitutional freedoms of the church, and upholding the charter freedoms. So after the British North America Act, which still undergirds Canadian law, in 1982, we had something called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This has been the first test. This 2 years has been the sort of first test of this kind of Nordic style written constitution. And unfortunately, it's proven to be pretty weak. The Section 2 guarantees the kind of freedoms you in the UK are familiar with, rights of assembly, speech, religion, worship, and so on and so forth. These are fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the Charter. They've been suspended indefinitely. We have had emergency powers invoked in provinces across the country. So Canada has local provincial government, and then it has the federal government. So, imagine it's a bit like the United States in the sense you've got the federal government, and then you've got state governors and so on. Similar in Canada. So you've had a variety of different approaches, but it's been in terms of severity, but it's been generally fairly uniform. And actually, Reagan, we've had over the past, among these resistant pastors, I say there have been some resistant leaders who have stood for the freedom of the church, stood for freedom of worship, stood for the charter freedoms at a deal of personal cost. So we've had pastors who have been fined heavily, churches that have been fined heavily for continuing to worship, hundreds of thousands in fines. We've had 2 pastors here who've actually gone to prison, 3, I should say, who have actually been in jail for several weeks in Western Canada for keeping their churches open. So it was pretty clear from the get-go that if you were going to make a stand, there could be a very significant personal price that Christians would pay for doing that. And unlike Scotland, where I think it was last year, 27 pastors or so brought a legal case against the Scottish government, and the High Court ruled in their favour and commanded the government to open the churches. Court cases here have failed, and the lawyers have failed. So Christians have been in a very tough spot. And it's meant that for a variety of reasons, I think some of it is fear, some of it has been the status quo is simpler, people burying their heads in the sand, hoping it's all just going to go away, a total failure to grasp the significance of the Christian world and life view. The good news has been for these churches and these Christian leaders who have spoken out and those who have remained open, their churches are exploding. Even this Sunday, I was in touch with a fellow pastor who was conducting 30 baptisms, and the church was so jammed. The police were called because there was a tailback down the road for a quarter of a mile of people trying to get into his car park. So churches that have remained open and remained faithful and resisted mandates have been exploding in number, and those that haven't have been struggling. Many churches are still online. and many have emptied out or are in the process of emptying out. So there has been a beneficial side to all of this. Like any situation where God is doing a work among his people, judgment begins at the house of God, scripture says. So there's a sifting been going on, there's a shaking been going on. And during that shaking, people have been looking for faithful pastors, faithful leaders who are speaking the truth of the gospel, the fullness of the lordship of Christ over both church and state and family, and who have been willing to stand for that. People have been seeking them out. And, even as a Christian organization and charity that's teaching about these things, the Ezra Institute, we've seen in a year a 900% growth in the sale of our resources, because we write about Christian worldview and the significance of the lordship of Christ and the gospel and how it applies to all of life. So there have been side benefits, let's call them fringe benefits. But overall, it's been very, very difficult. So you mentioned the Reopen Ontario Churches campaign. Then I drafted something called the Niagara Declaration, which had about 300 pastors sign from across the nation. And that was a document that several pastors joined me in tidying that up with a lawyer or two in finalizing that document. Then we went public with it. And it was sent to leaders for signature, and then sent to politicians. And it was a statement about the nature and freedom of the church. And again, it's hard to say sometimes exactly where the impact is happening. We certainly saw movement on some fronts, but not much. And when it came to this situation now, and I think many pastors who were standing up have been quite discouraged in the lead up to the truckers' convoy, because it was feeling as though we just couldn't seem to get any traction. We couldn't seem to get more of the sort of fence-sitting churches and leaders on board. There were so many Christians involved in this convoy. In fact, some part-time pastors who were part-time truckers from out west, that it seemed as though that this was going to be the thing that would really and it did really capture the imagination of people. In some respects, the truckers' triumph in capturing people's hearts and minds has been the tragedy of the church, because the church has failed to do what the truckers are now trying to do. And so when the emergency powers were used and we started seeing people trodden down in the streets and all these various threats being issued by the government, I drafted an open letter on behalf of several pastors who are very close to me here, who have been involved in all of these statements and campaigns. And then we got it signed by an additional 30 or so ministers just to get it launched. And it's an open letter. It's an open letter to the Prime Minister and to the federal government, basically explaining why we believe that the situation has come to where it has. The ignoring of the concerns of people for 2 years, and asserting the kingship of Christ and the lordship of Christ, and saying that the way that the government is acting and continuing is something that finally will invoke and is invoking God's displeasure. And that people in the end always pay a price when God judges something. So it's a respectful letter, but it is also a warning. And we are Christ's ambassadors as God's people, as Christian leaders. We're to be prophets, priests, and kings in the Lord Jesus Christ as Christians, and Christian leaders have a particular obligation to speak truth to power. And so that's the purpose of that. And we had, based on previous experience, very modest hopes for this letter, but it ended up, I think, within the first couple of days being signed by about 60,000 people. I don't know where it stands now. And then to our shock and surprise, and we now have no idea how this happened, actually, it was picked up by mainstream media in the United States, both Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire. Mm-hmm. And then on Friday, last week, it was the lead story on Fox News. So we were obviously very pleased for that, because one of the important things about that is that when you get a massive media coverage like that, just south of the border, of pastors rebuking the government Americans tend to take that much more seriously than Canadians, as you know. And the Americans have been very concerned about what appears to be the collapse of civil liberties and especially Christian freedoms in Canada. And in fact, about 24 hours after this letter was published, we saw that a congresswoman was saying that she was going to table legislation in the US Congress to offer asylum to Canadians fleeing religious persecution. Now, that kind of public pressure, that kind of press for the Canadian federal government is not good news at all. The most influential country on Canada today is, of course, the United States because of the trading relationship and because we've got the longest unguarded border in the world. And it matters to Canadian politicians how they're perceived by their southern neighbor. And so that kind of pressure, which we're very thankful to the Lord for, from our letter, we were thanking God that the Canadian media didn't pick it up, but because they don't want to. It's state media here. There is no independent. There's very little in the way of independent media. Just a few sort of online, very small, almost individuals with a handful of people working with them, but no major media that isn't essentially state funded and controlled. So they didn't pick it up, but mainstream media in the US did. And we're hopeful that all of this pressure, both from truckers, and of course, the problem now is that even though they've cleared the streets of Ottawa largely and cleared the trucks away, or they're in the process of doing so, this Emergency Powers Act has to be voted on, I believe today, actually, as to whether it can continue. I suspect it will pass and probably go through the Senate, which means they will have a total of 30 days. But I think the federal government is going to be quite possibly facing a game of whack-a-mole because these sort of convoys are showing up all over the country in different places. And so I don't think this is the end. Their clearing of the Ottawa protest, I don't.
Great interview there Reagan did with Dr. Joe Boot, who was one of the organisers of this important letter on behalf of Canadian pastors to send God's message to Justin Trudeau to not use executive emergency powers in order to oppress freedom and democracy and to persecute those involved in the Freedom Convoy. Reagan, you have the letter in front of you because you actually sent me the actual letter as Fox News picked this up over the weekend. Can you read out what the letter says? Because it's very, very chilling. And I think Justin Trudeau, if he doesn't repent, is heading down a very, very dangerous path.
We are writing to you as representative pastors of Christian congregations from across the nation and as law-abiding citizens who respect the God-defined role of civil government and uphold the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the highest law of our land, which recognizes the supremacy of God over all human legislation. They go on to say, the Ottawa protest has presented your government with a wonderful opportunity to meet with and speak to ordinary Canadians lawfully and peacefully, requiring the restoration of their constitutional rights. However, in response to their singing, praying, dancing, candy floss, bouncy castle, speeches about the Constitution, and outpourings of patriotic love for the country, your government has not only refused to meet with these citizens to hear their concerns, you have insulted, denigrated, and lied about them, further dividing a hurting and broken nation. Your government does not grant people the right to their bodily integrity, the right to work or earn a living, the right to decide for their children to be with their families or dying loved ones, the right to gather to worship and obey God, the right to travel in their own land or enter and leave. Civil government exists to protect these pre-political and fundamental freedoms, not bestow and remove them as if it can function in the place of God. They have called for repentance in the Canadian government, saying these tyrannical actions are exposing this government and people to the judgment of God, and we are deeply concerned that you do not appreciate the significance of God's wrath upon a rebellious and lawless nation. and they've asked Trudeau to repent of the sins of pride, rebellion against God, and bearing false witness, saying, "You have not displayed a brotherly care and love for these honest, hardworking people who have tried to peacefully bring their very serious concerns to your attention." Indeed, it's a horrifying news that we've been observing from Canada, that there were people seriously injured by the police action with horses against these protesters, and others doubtless mentally and emotionally just absolutely shattered. But praise God for these truckers, and praise God for these pastors who have come to raise their plight to the government.
I mean, I love Canada. It's a beautiful country. I've only been there once, but I mean, with the mountains and the Rockies, it's just an absolutely fabulous place. The Canadian people are kind of very warm, nice, polite people, not so loud as their neighbours in America, but really a nice, genuine people. And to actually think that, you know, the Canadian troops during the First and the Second World War came to the defence of Britain and Europe against tyranny, of Nazi tyranny and Nazism and fascism. I think they would be horrified today to realise what Justin Trudeau is doing to his own people. And this, I think, also fits into a kind of a globalist agenda, as clearly Justin Trudeau is actually seeing and testing the response of the Canadian people in a set of emergency measures that he's actually pursued. But I mean, what is so troubling is the fact is if, for example, as Christians, you can see how, as we move closer to the tribulation period, how the saints, as is mentioned in the book of Revelation, will face persecution. Because what it will mean is they'll have their bank accounts frozen. They won't be able to buy or sell because their accounts will be completely and utterly frozen because we don't agree with the line the government is making. So, for example, we can see a scenario that could only be a couple of years away whereby the Bible is actually banned, and saying, look, the Bible is banned, it's harmful, it's bad for society, so therefore we need to outlaw the Bible. And anyone that actually has possession of the Bible will freeze their bank accounts. And then literally, with criminal record, can't get jobs, can't get money. So this is the real danger in this. This is why our kind of mainstream media need to wake up. I know the Telegraph have covered it, the Times and others, but they should really raising the alarms that this is taking away the Canadians' democratic freedoms. And that is unthinkable even a year ago or 2 years ago.
And it's important for Christians to realize that everything, particularly that these pastors raise, these are not rights and freedoms granted by man. This is part of the life that is granted to us by God. Yes, there are times that we personally and voluntarily may lay aside our freedoms or our rights in some way, but that's not something that is right to take away. That's something that is voluntary. And in this situation, we have seen people stripped of much of what it means to be human, much of what it means to live for the sake of, so-called anyway, of saving life. But we don't see it working out that way at all. The rest of the world has come to terms with the reality of COVID-19 is endemic. It's now gotten to a stage where we're learning to live with the virus, so to speak. Our Prime Minister in the UK has said we need to treat it like flu, and yet Canada appears to be one of the very few nations that's actually digging its heels in. And the appearance is that Trudeau is wanting to hurt these people because he feels personally attacked. He's taken this personally. While it was meant to provoke discussion, he did not even attempt to have discussion If Trudeau was a man of the people, if Trudeau was a good leader, he would have gone to the truckers in person and would have listened to their concerns, would have talked with them, would have tried to see the lay of the land, would have expressed his concerns with them, would have tried to reason with them. If he felt right in his own perspective, he could have tried to reason with them, but he's not done that. Rather, he's tried to, with a totalitarian show of force, shut things down, invoking laws that are reminiscent of the social credit system in China.
Well done, a great job today, Reagan. Absolute pleasure to be with you on Behind the Headlines, and I want to thank you for watching this programme as it's aired in the evening on Wednesday night. I think what is really troubling, and this is why we need to really pray for the Freedom Convoy and those involved, and particularly the pastors, particularly the Christian truck drivers as well that are involved in this Freedom Convoy. This is something they wouldn't have taken lightly. This is something that they wouldn't have chosen to do if it wasn't for the extreme measures put in place by Justin Trudeau's government, and then the response by Justin Trudeau has been absolutely outrageous. So as you watch this programme, please pray for the Canadian people that democracy and their freedoms will be restored, because the democracy is so fragile and our freedoms are so fragile that we've got to fight for them. So I want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines.